Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. And welcome to All Saints Hall for our clergy class today. And welcome to everyone watching online on Facebook or the website or anywhere that you're watching our class. We're glad that you're with us. Today we're continuing a series on spiritual practices. So we decided in Lent to focus on spiritual practices that you might take on in your life. Lent is often the season where we take on practices. There's a trend now to kind of get away from giving things up and shifting towards taking things on. Has anyone given up anything, like given up chocolate or soda? How's it going? Okay, you don't have to share. Yeah. We're looking at spiritual practices. The last 2 weeks, we've had classes in here. The first one was on prayer. Chip taught about prayer as a practice, prayer as a way to kind of deepen your faith. Last week, there was a great conversation on reconciliation as a practice. And today, we're going to talk about Sabbath and rest. And that can be put together kind of as one phrase, Sabbath rest. So before we really get started, I want to kind of tell you the vibe we're going for today, okay? Because there's a tension when you talk about spiritual practices, that it can become another thing you need to add to your to-do list. And that is particularly a trap to look out for when we come to Sabbath rest, because we'll give you the spoiler for the end of it. None of us are resting enough. None of us are really following the commandment to have a Sabbath. But what we don't want you to do is leave this class thinking, oh gosh, I need to rest more. And then get a complex about how you're not actually resting enough, and then you get stressed out because you're not resting, and it just doesn't work. So that's not going to happen today. Instead, we want this to be kind of a fireside chat. So I think we'll have, in just a second, a stained glass window. There we go. Okay. I know it's really hot outside, and there's pollen, and so fire might not be the right image, but this is what we want this to feel like, okay? Because that's really the heart of Sabbath and rest, the commandment that God gives us, okay? All right, as we go, there'll be a couple points for questions, so please feel free to answer those, and we will try, again, not to kind of frantically work through the topic of Sabbath rest. So the first thing I want to say is something I talked to the adult formation class or confirmation class about last week, and it's the difference in the Episcopal and kind of Anglican tradition in how we view the faith. So I'm going to throw two big words at you to start. Please don't check out at this point and stop listening to the rest of the class. But there's a difference in religion between orthodoxy, and orthopraxy. Orthopraxy, okay? Does anyone know the root words there, what orthodoxy means? Okay, ortho means right, doxy means belief, right belief. So in a lot of religious traditions, right belief is the main thing. You need to believe the right things. So in a lot of denominations, they have a confession of faith, or they have kind of the basics of belief that looks like an outline that you need to kind of go through and check the boxes and make sure you're on board. We have that in the Episcopal Church. We have the ancient Nicene Creed, but we don't approach it in the same kind of check-the-box way. Instead, from the beginning, the Anglican tradition within the Christian church has been much more focused on orthopraxy. And that one kind of sounds like what it means. Ortho, right, praxy is praxis, practice, right practice of religion. That's the question we always want to ask in the Episcopal Church is, how are we living this out? It doesn't actually matter what you believe if it doesn't affect your life in any way. And a soapbox I love to get on is how this shows up in all other areas of our life as well. But if fitness and health were a matter of knowledge, we'd all be healthy and fit, right? Men's Health and Women's Health publish the exact same magazine every single month with the exact same information and the exact same 6 steps. They change the person on the cover, and that's it. We're still not there. So clearly, it's not just about having the right belief. It's about actually doing the things that we talk about. So that's a difference, pretty major difference in the Episcopal Anglican way. Okay. Does that feel like a good intro? Feel like we're all on the same page? All right, so we're going to start today talking about Sabbath and rest, and we're going to just talk a bit about where we first heard those phrases. So I wonder if you want to start, Elizabeth. When you think of your childhood, or you're kind of growing up in the faith, what was Sabbath? What did that mean to you, if anything?
Yeah, I like that. If anything, that helps me answer this question. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and we went to church every week, so I knew the word Sabbath from having learned the Ten Commandments, but we didn't talk about Sabbath. We didn't talk about Sabbath as a practice. We didn't really talk about Sabbath in our lives. When I reflected on this with Connor ahead of this conversation, I realized that my only memory that was Sabbath-like was the disappointment of a kid when things were closed on Sundays. And I realized that my kids probably don't really even have that experience, besides Chick-fil-A, which is very disappointing. But I can remember a lot of places several decades ago that were closed on Sundays. So I think that was my unwritten Sabbath example, but we didn't have much in our family.
Yeah, and it's unfortunately the same for me. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I like to say I kind of did the whole system. So I was an acolyte in the children's choir, youth group, UYC. I just did, surprise, surprise. Anytime the church door was open, I was there, basically. But Sabbath never really came across, even at church. We kind of heard it when we read the Ten Commandments and things like that, but it really never came across, and it really was not a practice in my home. The closest thing was watching golf on Sunday afternoons. My dad watching golf, I should say, which, as you probably know, golf is the perfect nap soundtrack. So my dad would watch golf, and I would be on the couch, sound asleep, while Scottish men whispered in the background about the game. That's the closest that I get to kind of Sabbath rest. There really was no understanding of it in my family. I wonder, just in maybe one or two words, what comes to mind for y'all when you hear the word Sabbath? And rest really as it's connected to Sabbath. But you saw this as the name of the class today, and what are two words, what popped into your head? I heard stop, not working, disconnect. Rest. Anyone want to be brave? Was it kind of scary or like a little off-putting, maybe?
I thought it was Sunday. I just connected it to Sunday, even though, that's Christians.
Yeah, so she just thought Sunday. Yeah.
I see hands.
Oh, yeah, there's a hand in the back. Body language? Yeah. All right, I'm going to sit up straight. It's a great.
I think orthopraxy is what we're getting.
Orthopraxy, chiropractic. Okay. Yeah.
The question popped,
How?
Yeah.
How?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, how? We'll get there. How would we even rest? Yeah.
Well, maybe we should start at the beginning.
Yeah.
About the
That's a good
creation
place to
narrative.
start.
That seems like a good place to start.
Yeah. So where does Sabbath come from? Because Sabbath is a unique idea in the Abrahamic religions. And we'll go back to Sunday school. Hopefully you all remember that God made the world in 7 days. What did God do on the seventh day? Rested. Miss Medeiros, I see. Everyone gets an A+ in Christian ed. God rested on the seventh day. And not only did God rest, God set the day apart and called it holy. So we'll come back to that. It's not just that God rested, and this is an important point to note. God didn't need to rest, right? It's not like God put God's feet up at the end of the week because God had worked really hard. God doesn't need rest in the way that we do. So there's something else going on. There's something deeper going on, that God works for 6 days to make everything and then sets the seventh day apart as a day to rest. So that's the creation story. We're going to fast forward through a lot of the Old Testament. We kind of move through and get to the Israelites in captivity in Egypt. They are slaves for 400 years, and what do they do all day, every day? Work. All day, every day. They are human doings, literally. We had the reading last week where we heard God say that, I've heard your groaning under your taskmasters. And that's literally all they did was what the taskmaster said to do. They got up and worked. And so when they come out of captivity, God has to reform them into a chosen people. And that's where we get the commandments. The commandments are not kind of God on high saying, you're all sinners and you just need the rules. It's God saying, you have been slaves for 400 years. You don't know how to be a people, how to be God's chosen people, and here are the guidelines. And so one of the things God says in the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment, is rest. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But it goes a little further than that, and we'll talk about this a bit later. It's not just you should rest. God institutes this sweeping idea of Sabbath basically to the whole culture. You should rest, your children should rest, your servants should rest, your animals should rest, the land itself should rest. That's a pretty all-encompassing command there. I wonder if you have any.
Well, I would add that it's not just a command to us and our community, but it tells us something really important about God, which it tells us that we have a God who's not looking at us to be anxiously productive people, but rather that we have a God who's looking for us to be people who are committed to neighborliness and to the good of the community. And I think we often lose that when we look at the list of commandments as a list of rules. We can perpetuate that experience of God giving us just one more thing or 10 more things or lists and lists of more things depending on which scripture we're looking at. But really what we know about God from this commandment about rest is that God is committed to our identities within community and within relationship.
Yeah. And I will say, and I mean this not to be accusatory at all because I am guilty of it as much as anyone. This commandment is the only one that we not only break, we kind of brag about breaking it, right? Mm-hmm. No one walks around talking about, yeah, I've really dishonored my mother and father this week, right? And even though our kind of whole economic system's based on coveting, we don't really come around saying, like, I'm really coveting the neighbor's car. But instead, when you say, hey, how are you? What do we say? So busy. I haven't had a day off in weeks. And then what does the other person say? Wow, yeah, me too. And sometimes you hear this thing, well, it's good to be busy, you know? We say, kind of with a tear rolling down our face. We've just totally neglected it. And we hear it, but we think, and I think that question of, well, how? How would I even step off the treadmill? I think Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning the blue laws that used to make it a little easier to rest on Sunday because things were just closed. You just couldn't do anything. It didn't matter if you wanted to. Certainly couldn't drink on Sundays, but you couldn't go anywhere. It seems so foreign and so upsetting to a lot of people that Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays. But that used to be the norm. And it was that communal way of kind of ensuring not only that everyone goes to church, because that was kind of the cultural assumption, but just assuring that everyone will rest, right? The pharmacy is just not going to be open on Sunday. We've kind of gotten pretty far away from that. And now not only is everything open on Sundays, but I think our culture has sped up. It seems like the treadmill we're on is just kind of sped up so much. The example that comes to mind for me is Amazon. Not only is it open all the time, but you can get something in 2 hours, whenever you want, right? There's no need to rest because I had the thought I need light bulbs. Boop, all right, light bulbs are here. It's incredible.
And Connor, you not resting by ordering light bulbs doesn't just create your work, but it creates work for the whole community. And that's a reflection that I think we are given more and more frequently now, that because we are always in relationship, we always are impacting others with our own actions. And in this case, when we don't rest, we require other people not to rest. Someone has to take that order and pack that order and deliver that order. I have this stack of books not as something to be more work for us, but instead for me, this is part of my fireside experience, is I always like to have a stack of books next to me, sometimes that I've read, sometimes that I hope I will read. But in these books, 2 of them have the word resistance in the title. This one is Sabbath as Resistance, and this one is Rest is Resistance. And I think that fits right into what we're talking about now. We are resisting what the messages we are given in our culture and in our lives by choosing to be people who work to honor Sabbath. We are resisting what we are taught about what it is to be productive, what it is to be part of a capitalistic society by choosing to find time to stop. And so there's a lot of writing right now about what it is to be justice-oriented as someone who rests, as someone who allows others to rest, and who notes the places where especially oppressed and marginalized communities are not given opportunities to rest. And so part of the work that I can read about in my stack, or that we can do as we reflect on our own actions, is to remember that our rest is a great equalizer. It offers something that we proclaim in our baptismal covenant about honoring the dignity of every human being.
Yeah.
And the earth, and animals, all of it.
Yeah. And it happens so often in our faith where kind of our modern experience, our modern science, everything catches up with ancient faith, right? It's all the science now about how meditation is so wonderful for you. And religious people are kind of saying, well, yeah. We've been saying it for thousands of years that sitting quietly and focusing on the presence of the divine within you is a helpful thing. It's true with all of these practices that it turns out that taking one day to rest, that not working all the time, is actually a helpful thing for your well-being. That we can't run all the time. We're just not designed to do it. You can fake it for a while, but eventually things break. And it's the same with the land. We're learning that constantly tilling and farming the same land over and over again and just spraying more and more fertilizers on the same patch of dirt, there's a moment where the dirt says enough. It's the same with all of it. So it seems as though in that first 7-day week, God knew what God was doing, right? And so this call to Sabbath and rest is not hopefully something new and novel, but just a return to something we have known for a long time. Before we move to what this might look like for all of us, I want to talk just briefly about our Jewish brothers and sisters who, many of them, particularly in the Orthodox branches of Judaism, still practice Sabbath kind of as it was intended to be practiced. Elizabeth, can you tell us about your experience, your sleepover experience?
Yeah. When I lived in Seattle, my family was in a neighborhood with several Orthodox temples, and we had many Jewish neighbors. And we had an experience when my oldest son was in elementary school where he played on a soccer team with a boy named Ben, who was one of 7 kids in an Orthodox Jewish family. And I noticed that Ben's family did things a little differently because anytime we had a game on Saturday, he just wasn't there. And it was funny because we were a church family, which was something my kids reminded me often, that being a church family means you miss out on things, but not in the same way that Ben did. We would make it work to get to a soccer game on Sunday and get to church on Sunday most of the time. But Ben was never there on a Saturday. And then one time, Ben's mom came up to me and she said, we would really like to have Matthew come and sleep over at our house. And I said, that would be great. We would love it. When are you thinking? She said, well, the best night for us would be Friday, but you need to make sure you get there on time. And I thought, well, is this a judgment on my mothering of 3 children? Because we're not usually on time. She was right. And she kept going and she said, we need you to make sure that you're there on time, because if you show up after 6 o'clock, sun goes down earlier in Seattle before we get closer to the solstice. If you show up after 6 o'clock, we can't open the gate for you. And I had to stop, and I was a little embarrassed and said, well, why doesn't the gate work at night? And she said, well, it's because it's Shabbat. We don't do anything, and we don't open the gate for anyone. She said, so Matt also can't come if he's going to need to call you, because we can't use the phone. I said, okay, I think that should be fine. And she said, but I think we will use it for 911 if we need it. And I was grateful for that. And I was grateful for her clarity. And it really still sticks with me because I am in awe of what that commitment was to keep her family of 7 children and her community committed to those boundaries, and then to be willing to invite other kids into it.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the notion of still participating in the world, but just like these are the boundaries of our religious practice. I think the Jewish practice is still so beautifully maintained, and it's one of the ways that Jewish communities maintain their kind of cohesiveness together is that they're all in this together to practice. I mean, y'all have probably experienced if you drive down Providence Road on Saturdays. I did it just this Saturday morning, and you'll see families walking to Temple Israel. And it's such a beautiful kind of outward and visible sign, as we would say, of this practice that they take seriously. Yeah.
As someone who's always looking to spread practices of faith at home and to practice them with my own family, I really appreciate the commitment of this Orthodox community to Sabbath because it offers what to do and how to do it so that it's an easier response, or you have an easier way to respond to this countercultural action. So for me, knowing what I know about the Shabbat practice, knowing that there is a ritual at home for whoever is gathered of candle lighting, of sharing challah, of wine, of blessings, I notice those connections to things that we do in our ritual, and I appreciate that those are things that families have committed to for generations and still are able to do as a way to give some kind of boundaries to this practice that is not an easy one to uphold.
Yeah, and it's such an invitation. Has anyone here, can you raise your hand if you've participated in like Shabbat dinner at someone's house or, okay, a few folks, to really participate in it. And the spectrum really ranges from kind of like full on, no lights on, just candles, like if there's an elevator in the apartment building, we're not taking the elevator because it's set, like that kind of practice, to a little bit more moderate. But my experience in college, my thesis advisor was Jewish, and at the end of our big kind of capstone seminar, she had our group to her house for Shabbat dinner. And it very much, in the same way our liturgy at its best communicates this, you're entering into something else with a capital E, right? Like something totally different is happening here. You can take your watch off because time is not really important at this point. It's very holy. And it's such a good reminder of kind of who we are, right? Like you leave Shabbat dinners feeling like an embodied human being, a limited, finite, overwhelmingly loved human being. And it's just so wonderful. It's really nice to see that and to participate in it because from the outside, and again, we're kind of getting to the so what? How do we actually do this? I don't know about you, but there's a lot of me responds with like, seems impossible. I have 3 young kids. I went to 3 birthday parties yesterday and a soccer game, right? Like the idea of a Sabbath rest. One was a drop-off party, so the parents in the room know, like, the great news there. But it seems so foreign to us now because we've really lost the thread of this practice. And I think you said we're a church family, and so they knew that meant giving up. And we didn't talking about this, but I love that note. Because that's the invitation to all of these practices, but particularly Sabbath rest. By saying yes to Sabbath means you will have to say no to a good number of things. And we'll talk about some of those things that we say no to are great, like we want to say no to worrying. Everyone's on board with that. We want to say no to kind of wanting more and more and more. I think everyone's on board with that. But it may mean saying no to otherwise really good things.
Yeah, that phrase came up in my family we were in the car and we were talking about a weekend, and I listed church as the activity, and one of my kids said, "But everybody else is going skiing." And I said, "I know, but we've got church." And they said, "Well," and Matt said, "Well, I don't want to be a church family. I want to be a ski family." And I think what that did was give us words to wrap around the identity that we were committed to building for our family. And I think that's what we are given when we think about what it is to be people of Sabbath, people of rest. Because I read, as we were preparing in one of my favorite children's Bibles, the Book of Belonging, a statement that said, in Sabbath we are reminded that we are human beings. We are not human doings or human havings. And that sticks with me as well, and I wonder if it will stay with you, and maybe it offers some words if you're trying to explain what we're doing here, because it is a gift that we are given when we stop to be able to have a better lens to identify ourselves and to not do that through what we're doing or what we're buying or what we're enjoying with other people, but rather through the very being, the very presence that we have in ourselves and with others.
Yeah. I want to recommend here in this fireside book chat with Elizabeth and Connor, this book with this beautiful cover called The Sabbath by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It's a short book. It's really beautifully written, and it's kind of if you take any class on Sabbath, they're going to start with this, because it's his reflection on the Jewish practice. And really, it's everything we've said so far. This idea that the Sabbath is not just the day to put your feet up. It's not just like my example. It's not just the day to put your feet up and watch golf and rest. There's something else. God set apart an entire day for folks to remember. Remember who they are. Remember that God is God. And remember that kind of everything is a gift. So I just highly recommend this little book as a way into the idea of Sabbath, because his writing is so beautiful, and the case he makes for the Sabbath is pretty compelling. So highly recommend Abraham Joshua Heschel. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're right around the halfway point. So I think we need to shift into the so what. How do we actually do it? How do we rest? How do we observe the Sabbath? And there's a lot of different kind of practical things to consider. Someone already named the idea that kind of church on Sunday morning is Sabbath, but is not really Sabbath, and just your comparative religion lesson for the day. The three Abrahamic religions all observe some kind of Sabbath practice, and because we just can't agree on much, in Islam it's Friday, in Judaism it's Saturday, in Christianity, except for the Seventh-day Adventists and a few others, it's Sunday. So if you were to participate in all three religions, you could get a whole weekend of Sabbath rest. But every religion holds in some way a day that is set apart. And I do want to say, before we get into the kind of practical side of it, I think Sunday morning at church can be a part of your Sabbath practice. But I will say, it should not be your only Sabbath practice. Coming to church on Sunday should not be kind of the box that we check that we had done Sabbath and rested. In the same way that before church, it doesn't really happen at Christ Church, but in a lot of Episcopal churches, the time right before a church service is really sacred and protected. That quiet time in the church to kind of pray right before church happens. And people get very upset if there's a lot of talking in the church. Again, doesn't happen at Christ Church, but if there's a lot of talking right before church and you kind of come in, you kneel, that's your time, right? And what I always remind people is that shouldn't be the only time you're praying. It's really wonderful if that is a sacred time to kind of recollect yourself and get ready for church. But if the 5 minutes before church on Sunday is the only time, is your special time for prayer, there are bigger issues. And we should look at kind of how you carry this out all through your life. So it's the same with Sabbath practice. I think coming to church is a beautiful part of Sabbath. The clergy talk a lot about shifting our view of Sunday morning from, it's exactly what you named, this kind of nice addition to the weekend. So we have a lot going on. I've got 3 birthday parties and soccer and family in town and all that kind of stuff. If we can make it to church, great. But if we can shift to get more of that kind of Jewish mindset of worship communally is the start of the week, that everything turns on this, then I think it can be a beautiful, beautiful part of Sabbath practice. But Sabbath can really be any day, particularly as we talk about Sabbath coming up. So I wonder if you have any thoughts before we jump into the reasons we might Sabbath.
It feels really hard. And I know that, and I heard it as we started. And I think that I would say before we go any further, it's good to know that there are people who are doing it really well, and there are people who take on the practice in a very extreme way, and it's easy to find those examples. So I loved reading this book called Sabbath in the Suburbs, which was written by a Presbyterian minister who committed for a full year to Saturday Sabbath for her family. And she wrote an entry for each month, sharing particular stories about what happened in their family. But she ended each chapter with a Sabbath hack. And it's because what she realized was the only way that you could commit to this practice of Sabbath was by having things that you cut off, or things that you pieced together, or places where you took a little cheat, because she, like us, are real, dynamic human people who have a lot of different things that pull us and things that happen that are unexpected and that are out of our control. And so that gave me a lot of comfort as I read this book, because her reflections on how it felt to be in Sabbath, she wrote about how it felt like cheating time, really spoke to me. And yet I felt very overwhelmed by the idea that I could commit with 5 walkers every week a full 24 hours. And so it was helpful to me to have that hack section at the end of each chapter to be reminded that we are all doing that.
Yeah, that is really helpful. Okay, there's a couple things that kind of answer the question, why Sabbath? You hopefully are convinced already. At least you're open to the idea that you might need a little rest and a little Sabbath. There's a book that I think is, I think you have it over there, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, by a guy named John Mark Comer, and he's got a couple other books where he outlines 3 or 4 reasons to take sabbatical, to kind of have Sabbath time. Sorry, I do have a sabbatical coming. That's why that's on my brain. And so we're just going to work through those. These are the 3 or 4 things we do that make a Sabbath a Sabbath. So as you start thinking about what a Sabbath practice might look like for you, these are some of the hallmarks. So the first one he lists is stop. Someone named that. Stop. Not only do we kind of stop the just frenetic busyness, or try to, we stop a couple specific things. So he lists, we stop worrying. Now, I wish it were that easy to just say, I'm going to stop worrying and stop worrying. But we can think about ways that we might stop worrying, things we might do that would help us stop worrying. So an example might be finding a 24-hour period where you don't look at the news. You just don't look at it. I think turning off news notifications on your phone is a good practice all the time. But a Sabbath practice might be, okay, from Friday night to Saturday night, I'm not going to look at any headlines. I'm going to trust that if something really big happens, someone will tell me. But otherwise, I don't need to know every single little thing going on around the world. There are some ways that we can kind of surrender things we're worried about on a more micro scale, too. So checking email, checking work email in particular. That might be something you surrender for a bit. There are some prayer practices and some ways you can develop the habit of actually handing things over to God. I think in a class, I don't know if it was in here, I mentioned that in the Catholic Church, there's this thing called the Surrender Novena. So it's a 9-day set of prayers, but my wife and I really love, and she has a coffee mug that says this. The prayer you pray every day is, Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything. That's it. She loves drinking her coffee in the morning and looking at that. The kids are running around, and she's just, surrendering everything. But if we take that seriously, particularly for a Sabbath practice, we can really start to kind of change our heart and say, okay, for this day, I'm just going to let go of worrying about my uncle and the way he interacts with our family, or I'm going to not worry about whatever the situation is, and just give it to God. Another thing that Comer mentions is we stop wanting. We've named this already. I think our culture is really built on wanting and cultivating your desire for things. And one thing we can do in a Sabbath practice is to just say, I'm not going to buy anything for 24 hours. The light bulb example I used is probably the easiest one. Okay, I'll buy the light bulbs tomorrow. I don't have to do it right this moment. Not only will that help your pocketbook eventually, because you'll put purchases off and decide actually we don't need the thing, but it's another way we kind of surrender to the reality that we're not in control. We're not God. Okay, anything on stopping before we move on?
No, but I don't want to miss delight.
Oh no, we're going to get there.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Was that a spoiler?
It was. It's
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
It's fine. And we'll come back when we get to actual in the weeds practices. There's a lot of different ways to kind of stop things. But I used at the beginning, my go-to metaphor for the world we're living in right now, at least for me, it just feels like I'm on a treadmill most of the time. And I've said before, it feels like someone keeps coming in every night and turning the speed up and turning the incline up. And I wake up and I'm like, oh gosh, it's faster, but I can't do anything. And so a Sabbath practice is an invitation to step off the treadmill, just for a day. Okay, the next practice is delight. Yes, delight. It's so good. So we all have things to share about that. One book recommendation, it's a great book on Sabbath called Sabbath by Dan Allender. But he really focuses in a way that I had not heard before. He focuses on delight as a Sabbath practice, which I think is just so beautiful. The idea that, again, if God doesn't need to actually rest, physically rest, then what is God doing on the Sabbath? And his answer is, and the Jewish answer from a lot of rabbis and scholars is, God is delighting in creation. God looked at everything God had made and said, it is good. It's good. And so delight as a primary practice. And so it may not mean you don't drive your car for 24 hours, or it may not even mean you don't look at the news if you just can't get there. But maybe the mark of a practice for you and your family on Sabbath is, what brings us delight? How can we delight on this day? Okay.
I was excited to get to share with you. This was a book I mentioned called The Book of Belonging, and it's one of my favorite books of Bible stories that has recently been published. It's got beautiful imagery. It's a wonderful gift. I have no connection to this book, by the way.
Use code WALKER at checkout, and you.
But I wanted to read to you from the creation story because it speaks just to this, and it connects us all the way back to that place at the very beginning where we learned about Sabbath. The author writes, after all the creating and delighting and naming, God rested. And God created this resting time, Sabbath, and declared that it should be celebrated like a little holiday at the end of every week. A reminder of what God did after God made us. Like a mama who snuggles up to enjoy her baby after giving birth, looking over its little ears and tiny fingernails, God stopped and enjoyed the good creation. It was as it should be, nothing left to do but be together. And just as you will never stop being your mama's baby, no matter how big you get, God's people will always belong with God, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It's a beautiful image. That is what God is doing on the Sabbath, and that's what we are invited to do as well. So the next one kind of fits right on that. It'll circle some same themes, but The third is rest. We should rest on Sabbath. Again, not rest as the chance kind of to fall onto the couch because you're utterly exhausted after a week and to sleep all day, but instead to actually rest. And we all know the difference between kind of sleeping and resting, or that deep kind of bone rest, right, where you're actually rejuvenated. I think that's what is called for, the chance to rest from our work. This is such a key in the Jewish practice, but it's key in Christianity too. The pattern of Jesus was a pattern of Sabbath and a pattern of rest. Now, he didn't necessarily stop working on the Sabbath, and that got him into some hot water. But what did Jesus do right before or right after every major miracle or big kind of teaching moment? He went off. And it drove his disciples crazy, because he's just preached this knockout sermon. And people are lined up to see him, and they could really grow the movement and really, have some big success here in Capernaum or wherever. And he goes off by himself. He goes off by himself to stop and to rest. And we'll say this kind of at the end, but what he's doing is getting his mind right. He's reordering his priorities. He's remembering, do you know that one story where he heals a bunch of people, I think in Capernaum, and they want to make him king, basically? They come to take him and forcibly make him their king. And he runs off and goes to be alone and pray. Because we need those moments to remember, just like Jesus. He was not called to be the town manager of Capernaum. He was called to be the Savior. In the same way, we are all called to do specific things. And if we stay on the treadmill too long, suddenly everything seems like a good idea. And we end up saying yes to a bunch of stuff that we had no business saying yes to, because it's not our work to do. But when you're exhausted and you are just have been saying yes for so many years, suddenly you find yourself kind of trapped in that. So this idea of rest and delight and stopping is all wrapped up in Sabbath. So one last thing on delight before we move to rest. In this book on the Sabbath, Abraham Joshua Heschel has this beautiful quote that would make a beautiful thing like cross-stitched on a pillow. So recommend that for a gift. But his quote is, "Just to be is a blessing. Just to live is holy." And that's the reminder of Sabbath. Just to be. You woke up this morning and drew breath. What a blessing. What a blessing. Before you could do anything, before you could check your email or get anything done on your to-do list, you were blessed. You woke up. You get to be here, and that's a beautiful, holy blessing. So that's the kind of delight we want to tap into on Sabbath. Okay, so 2 quotes on rest. And these are linked to all the spiritual practices. And you'll see it was not the image that we use for practices, but all of these are like a big Venn diagram. They all overlap. Prayer is tied to reconciliation, is tied to rest, is tied to sharing your gifts. They're all linked kind of at the heart. But 2 quotes came to mind when we were thinking about rest. One is from a Catholic theologian named Ronald Rolheiser, whose definition of prayer is relaxing into the goodness of God. Prayer is relaxing into the goodness of God. And Chip named this in the class. Sometimes we think in his class 2 weeks ago, we think prayer is kind of lobbing requests up somewhere, right? Like paper airplanes with our deepest needs written on them. And that certainly is a part of prayer. But I love this definition that prayer is relaxing into the goodness of God. Suddenly that sounds very attractive. That doesn't sound like I need to be praying more, because that's often the lesson I get from any kind of class on prayer. But instead, just relaxing into the goodness of God, to the blessing of existence. The next one comes from a theologian and philosopher named Dallas Willard, who was asked in an interview to describe Jesus in one word. And guess what word he used? Relaxed. And that totally kind of reoriented my mind and heart there. Describe Jesus in one word: relaxed. Jesus wasn't worried. He wasn't frantically kind of running around, making sure everything was taken care of. He wasn't constantly refreshing the notifications, right? And I think there's two causes of that. One is he was God, so it does make it easier. But the other was the practices that he lived out. This rhythm that he had of rest, Sabbath, getting away, remembering who he is, and then coming out and engaging the world. And so to the question, I don't know, did anyone have the "What would Jesus do" bracelet growing up? They're back in, which is great. Dig mine out of storage. What would Jesus do? We don't often think the answer is relax. What would Jesus do? Take a breath. Put his feet up, right? Do you remember the disciples are on the boat and the storm comes and Jesus is sound asleep in the hull of the boat? Yeah, I think that's the invitation to all of us. Okay. Last thing on why we might Sabbath. I think you're getting the picture, hopefully. But we mentioned this a couple times already. The primary goal of Sabbath is to reorder our priorities, to remind us who we are, to remind us that we are not God. Because that temptation is real. That's the first temptation in the garden. What does the serpent say to Adam and Eve? If you eat this fruit, you will be like God. And I think that's all of our invitation. I can push a button and have anything from around the world brought to my doorstep. I mean, we live like royalty. So we can kind of get in that mindset of, I make things happen. Unfortunately, it takes in our lives the big moments of disruption to be reminded that we are not in control. And the Sabbath practice is a way to kind of soften the blow by each week willingly entering into this time where we say, okay, I'm not God. The sun will rise whether I'm up to date on my email or not. The sun will set whether I know exactly what's happening on the Potomac. Right? Okay, any thoughts on why before we move into the practicalities?
No, I'll move us into the practicalities.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Because I think it goes hand in hand to consider if we're going to stop being human doings or human havings and really focus on being human beings, that we identify ourselves as not God, but as who we truly were created to be by God. And it's this Sabbath work that makes the space to do it. I jumped ahead when I talked about the Sabbath in the Suburbs book, because that book is about a family's effort to practice this exercise. And the practice of Sabbath is like any other exercise. When you decide that you want to get stronger, if you go to the gym once a month or once a year, you will not find that you can lift anything more than you could before. But if you go every single week or twice a week and you treat those exercises as something that are part of the regular rhythm of your life, you find yourself after some time stronger. And the same thing is true for these spiritual exercises, for this practice of Sabbath, for the practice of prayer, of reconciliation, these practices that we've been talking about. These are things that if we do them regularly, we will find that then we are able to more clearly see ourselves, who we are created to be, who we are. And that is what the invitation is if we take on a monthly family stop to claim another day as Sabbath, or even some much smaller practice as an individual or as a community. We will find that if we do them regularly, no matter how big or how small, change will happen.
Yeah. And I think the invitation, look around, we're in a room full of people, and there's folks watching online who at least are interested enough to come to this class on Sabbath and rest. With anything, it's really hard to do things in isolation, but if you get a couple friends to decide to practice Sabbath together, or get a couple families that decide we're going to do this all together, you have a much better chance of doing it, because eventually, if you kind of take this to the extreme place, it's going to mean saying no to some things. You might become the family that doesn't do anything on Saturdays. Or maybe your kid just doesn't play sports on Sundays. And that's just part of the deal. Right? And so it helps to have a community. It's just like anything, if you're trying to get your teenager to not use their phone as much, it's helpful to have a few other teenagers whose family's also getting them to not use their phone as much. And it's also helpful for the parents to not use your phone as much. Okay, that's a different topic.
But
Won't
not
wade
really,
into the water.
because I think technology is a place where we can identify change over generations and where many of us can make small tweaks that can become Sabbath practices and that I think we can make bigger change in our lives. You talked about a couple in your family.
Yeah, okay, so into the practical weeds. There's one way to do this, and some of you may be wired this way, the kind of all or nothing folks who say, all right, we're doing it. Next week, we're going to do 24 hours without whatever. If that's you, God bless. I wish you well.
You can lead the next forum, please.
You can tell us how it's going. I think for a lot of us, we're going to need to kind of tiptoe our way into this. And so I'll tell you a bit about what my family is trying and failing, but trying to do, and then give you a couple kind of small things you may do. So my wife and I have decided we are just on our phones too much, which I know we're the only people who have decided that. We're just on our phones too much. And we've kind of been saying that out loud for a couple of years now, and then nothing changes. In part because we're broken, flawed humans, in part because the thing you hold in your hand was designed by companies with billions of dollars to keep it in your hand as long as possible. So it's not a fair fight, just so you know. You're not crazy. But what we've decided is we're going to do our best on Friday nights to put the phone in the cabinet above the dishwasher, to just put it in there. And we're not saying we can't use our phones, but to use our phones, we're going to have to get up and go to the kitchen, get it out of the cabinet, and use it standing right there. We're not taking the phone anywhere other than right in that corner. And so if we want to stand there shoulder to shoulder and scroll, we could do that. It's just not very fun, right? That's not a great use of time and energy, and I've been standing all week, and I don't want, So that's one thing we're doing. We are also trying our best, and I'm kind of using my phone to do this, even apart from the kind of Friday to Saturday, to just use my phone less. There's a focus mode, at least on iPhones. You can create focus modes, and you can eliminate notifications from certain apps. You can also name the focus mode and really customize it. So what I've done now is I have a focus mode that automatically starts on Friday nights and runs until Sunday morning, called Weekend Sabbath. And when you do that, it shows up on your phone on the bottom of my home screen. When I turn it on, it says Weekend Sabbath, which that alone is a reminder, because I'm going to check ESPN to see the thing, and I pull my phone up and it says Weekend Sabbath. And suddenly, past Connor has convicted me. And I put my phone down and go, okay, yeah, it's Weekend Sabbath. There's some practical benefits too, because I've eliminated all notifications from anyone except my kind of immediate circle of family. We were having a conversation this weekend about Sabbath, and we had a time, and Elizabeth needed to change the time, and I didn't see the message because my phone was not working, so I just called her at the normal time. So that's one really practical example, but I want to even lower the bar more. It doesn't have to be a full day. One thing you can do is, and tech experts talk about this all the time, put your phone to bed at night. Kind of call that Sabbath. So an hour before you go to bed, put your phone away. Maybe put it in the cabinet, put it in the drawer, and leave it there. And then you give yourself a little bit of time without it. In the morning, please don't look at your phone first thing. Because nothing good comes of that. Instead, a good thing to do might be to pray right when you wake up, to maybe look at Scripture. I've heard it referred to as Scripture before screen. Again, it's just these little ways that we're kind of marking out time and setting things apart. I wonder if there are any other practices.
I've got a final one that will draw us to our close, and that is a reminder that spiritual practice always is easier in community. Just like for me, going to the gym is easier in community, committing to these practices together is something that often gives the ability to endure even when you're doing something countercultural. And for me, thinking about gathering at church is an important part of Sabbath. And perhaps a way you can set aside time for your family is thinking about your church practice, not just as the 1 or 3 hours that you're here at Christ Church each week, but instead with that idea of the morning beginning on the night before. So perhaps there are things that you change in your own life as you prepare for bed that night, on Saturday night, or even earlier, where what you're doing is organizing yourself, your mind, your body, your house towards that thing that you're doing as we gather together to worship God on Sunday morning. And I think that that can be a valuable way to note and set aside time, maybe even in a way that feels less invasive than a whole day, but that puts you in a place where you're able to then join with all of us who are here in community and trying with all we have to make this part of our regular rhythm.
And I think the invitation, just like we said at the beginning, is that hopefully this hasn't sounded too intimidating and you're leaving kind of with your head hung low because you can't imagine what this might look like in your life. I think we can be in conversation together and we can start small. There's a trap in life on the treadmill. And there's a trap in kind of thinking you're God. And I named it already. Those big moments of life will happen where you are brought face to face with the reality that you are not God and you can't run forever. Your body will break down. You will lose someone you love. You will lose the thing that you thought gave you all your control and power. You will lose it. And the promise of life as a human, as a frail human being, is that one day it will end. And the early church called death sleep, falling asleep in the Lord. So we know there is rest coming. The invitation that God gives us in Sabbath is to claim our rest now, to claim our real identity as a human being, as a beloved child of God, to claim the notion that before you could do anything, you were called enough. And that's what the practice of Sabbath do. So it may be 24 hours, it may be one deep breath. But my hope for all of us is that we can claim some kind of rest. And wouldn't it be great if we had little pockets of groups practicing Sabbath together? And wouldn't it be great if Christ Church became known as the church that rests well? And what would that do? And I can already hear the voice in my head is like, yeah, but we got to get out there and we got to do more and we don't want to be that church. I don't know. Okay, we're going to close with a prayer. There's a ton of beautiful prayers about rest and Sabbath in the prayer book. But I think I want to invite us just to take a couple deep breaths before we pray. Breathe in. Breathe out. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that. And as you breathe deeply, just note what has come up for you. Where has your heart been drawn to this notion of rest? Where has your heart been drawn to the idea of delight? And notice where your mind has spoken up and said, it's impossible for us. I could never. In this moment, I invite God to calm our minds and to fill our hearts with His Spirit. Lord, give us the courage, give us the strength, give us the faith to trust that when you said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, that you were talking to me. You were talking to us. Help us surrender, Lord. Help us rest in you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, thanks, y'all. Go take a nap.